PJ Raval has spent his career asking a deceptively simple question. Whose stories are we willing to see, and whose stories have we been taught to ignore? He's an award-winning Filipino American filmmaker whose documentaries explore identity, community, justice and belonging. Across films including Call Her Ganda, Before You Know It and Who We Become, his work follows people whose lived experiences reveal much bigger questions about power, history, colonialism, ageing, queerness, and what it means to find home. What struck me most about this conversation wasn't just PJ's extraordinary filmmaking, it was discovering that before he ever picked up a camera, he trained as a molecular biologist. We ended up having one of my favourite conversations on the podcast about the surprising parallels between science and art, why experiments never really fail, and how curiosity can become the engine for an entire creative life. We also explore growing up as a queer Filipino American in a small conservative town, navigating isolation, discovering filmmaking almost by accident, and why every documentary he makes is also a way of understanding himself. If you've ever wondered how artists choose the questions that become their life's work, or how creativity can become a way of making sense of the world, I think you're going to love this conversation. Welcome to the Extraordinary Creatives podcast. PJ, fabulous to have you here. Would you do us the honour of introducing yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're based today?
Yeah, my name is PJ Raval. I am a queer Filipino American filmmaker. I largely have been making documentary films for the last maybe 15 years, though I have a long history of also working in scripted and music video and all things kind of moving images. I am joining you today from my home office in Austin, Texas, which was largely in disarray up until about 5 minutes ago. With your expert help of moving some things out of the way. Largely because I'm in the process of relocating to Toronto, Canada. Kind of a big move because I've been in Austin, Texas, based in and out of here for about 20 years, actually. Even though I'm originally from California, and prior to that, my family comes from the Philippines, but I kind of grew up on the west coast of the United States, and now I will be moving away from the United States. So that's kind of an exciting, but also a little bit of a nerve-wracking kind of experience.
Yeah, so we can imagine all of the things that are at play for you at the moment. So there's a deep community that you've been part of, and obviously Austin has got an incredible filmmaking kind of history there, so love to learn a little bit more about that. And Canada, obviously, so many more exciting opportunities coming your way, so we can hear a little bit more about that. But let's have a look at those early roots, because I think what you've described in terms of where you grew up and the family that you grew up, I think it'd be really interesting to hear a little bit about kind of who you grew up with, and what do you think that context of being a Filipino American in a small conservative town fed your work. Who did you grow up with, and what kinds of creativity was at play for you?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I think like a lot of people who are first generation or whose parents were immigrants, my story really begins with my parents' immigration story. So, my mother, as a single woman, left the Philippines, originally had immigrated to Canada, actually, to Toronto. So in a strange way, I'm kind of reverse migrating. But she had immigrated originally to Canada and was in Toronto, and my father had immigrated from the Philippines to New York City. And both of them are from the northern area of the Philippines. And luck would have it that my mother would go visit her brother in New York and eventually meet my father. And, they got married, had kids, and eventually made their way from New York to a small, tiny town in Central California called Clovis, which I don't even remember the population when we arrived, which was in the early 80s, but it was less than 50,000 people, I think. It
How
was a
did they
pretty
choose
small
Clovis?
town. That is a great question, and we should really get my mother on here to talk more about that. Because I often wonder why she and he moved from, New York to that, but and with New Jersey kind of in between. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think what really happened, and I might be projecting here, but this is in the 80s where I think culturally there was this look at California and these ideas of like, get a house with a swimming pool in sunny California, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who are not from California, when they think of California, they do think of that. And they often think of like Los Angeles or maybe San Francisco or San Diego or Santa Cruz. I grew up in the area that was none of that. The area that I grew up in was largely agricultural. It was pretty isolating for someone who was, Asian American, Filipino American, and also queer. And it was, at the time, really a small conservative white Christian kind of town. And my family, while I was growing up in elementary school, primary school, I did not know anyone else who was Filipino. It was really just my family and then my, extended family that was throughout California and the East Coast. So so to your question, it really created a formative experience of feeling isolated, singular, and kind of, in later years, what I would describe as being an outsider.
Did creativity play a part in any of your coping mechanisms?
Coping mechanisms. That's a great, that's a great one to bring up. Yes, I think it did because I pride myself on being a very studious person, even till today. Like I do consider myself someone who's very interested in learning about things, different people, different cultures, different facts. We can go into that later in terms of college. But prior to that, I think because everything was so isolating and I'm just going to use this word a little bit lightly, but for lack of a better description, traumatizing, kind of growing up in this environment. I really disliked school for a very early part of my childhood, and I often would ditch school. Like I have very vivid memories of like first grade, second grade, like just leaving school and walking home, or things like that. Like I was just very not feeling connected. But the one thing that I enjoyed was Friday we had art day, and during Fridays, whether it be creating like an animal out of construction paper or a little mold of something with clay. Like I just loved, what they called craft day, right? Or whatever it was. But at that age, sadly, it wasn't really encouraged, even though I remember creating, and the reason I bring up a paper fish, out of construction paper is because I remember creating one. And then at the time, I think it was my second grade teacher was like, oh, we're going to enter this in some local like art fair for the students. And I don't know, it was just a really interesting experience to think about building some kind of identity based off of creativity. However, that was not what was encouraged. And what was encouraged was when I did start applying myself, I was doing well in regards to the sciences, in regards to, writing essays, math, things like that. So it kind of ended, my early memories are, yes, there was, these creative Fridays and things like that. But then probably by the time I was in like fourth grade, things like that, it was more like, I somehow managed to enter what they called the gifted and talented program, because I started applying myself more and doing well in terms of like more, I don't want to say non-creative studies, but the more traditional subjects, like, again, like math, sciences, things like that.
Yeah. And was that
And
encouraged
yeah.
further at home too? Sort of you being in that gifted program, I guess, also gave you a sense of identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think this is, again, part of the time period where, in the history of, in my experience in the United States specifically, there's more visibility to an Asian American community. And I think the stereotypes around that were Asian American kids are smart and studious and good, and it very much falls into what, a lot of ethnic and cultural scholars would call the model minority myth, right? Like this idea, like, oh, these minorities are great minorities, right? They're smart and they go to school, and I even remember there was a Time magazine cover around this time period that had a picture of all these young Asian American kids, like, in their glasses and their maybe Jordache jeans and Izod t-shirt, Izod shirts, and it said the whiz kids, and it was like, a kid with like, resting his arm on a computer, and, like a young girl with glasses, like smiling, holding a book, like it was that kind of thing. And I remember early on being like, oh, I don't feel aligned with that. But in retrospect now, speaking with you about it, like, I think that's what I was pushed towards, right? Because I
Yeah.
think that's what the world and my surrounding community thought was supposed to happen. And I think it took like decades to kind of rebel against that to where we are today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've spoken to a few people on the podcast, and I have experienced this in my own family. I think that when the parents have an immigration story, very often that desire for kids to excel clearly is connected to safety, right? So there's that ambition for the kids very often can feel or be interpreted by lots of people in terms of driving success, because money will give you some kind of stability, but also it's about that belonging, right? That if you are excelling in the culture in some way, then you will be taken in, you will belong to it in some way. And so when we feel untethered in some way or unmoored, it can be very easy to be swept along by those hopes and aspirations, because subliminally we don't want to let our parents down. We don't want to, we're also not quite sure, we haven't quite become ourselves fully yet. So the idea that there could be some kind of, that we can kind of tether ourselves in some way feels attractive, but it happens so subliminally we don't even know that's what we're doing. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, first of all, I think you nailed it on the head, right? Like this idea of, people don't say necessarily like, oh, I'm moving to another country for better opportunities for my child to be an artist, you know, though,
Yeah.
though it certainly should be,
Yeah.
part of that. But of course, even as someone who works in the creative field, like, yes, we all know that, working in the creative arts in any form or fashion is, a little bit of a challenge in terms of job stability and market and industry and things like that. But I think specifically thinking about my parents as Filipino immigrants, I think in later years, starting to explore more my identity and my own history, like I think there's also a large history of, which of course we can't ignore, colonialism,
Mm.
both physically and culturally, right? So I do think, my parents growing up post World War II have very, they grew up in the climate in the Philippines of thinking the United States is the savior. They're great, they're amazing, they're aspirational. The thing you want to do is immigrate and move to the United States and be part of this American dream, this American experience, right? And I think many of those people's kids, my generation, then spend a lifetime recognizing that we're kind of the product of that, right?
Yeah.
And this experience of growing up in this small town, which is very kind of Americana in its culture, is also the product of that, and having to recognize that that experience is part of a colonized experience, not one that I ever willingly entered. Right? It's just part of
Yeah.
this narrative that's been set up that all of us are now trying to recognize and try to maneuver around, and hopefully trying to dismantle.
Did you
Yeah.
feel a sense of disappointment in that ideology from your parents at all?
Well, what's interesting is I do think early on I had a lot of anger and resentment about it, especially as a teenager, right? As a teenager, I was so, I don't think it appeared so, but I think internally I was really angry and really confused. Why would my parents do this? Like, and I even had photos of us growing up on the East Coast, if things were a little bit more diverse and inclusive. And I think as I got older, and especially today, and what's interesting talking to you about it, and this is really one of the first places I've kind of openly talked about me and my plans to immigrate to Canada, is that I think I started recognizing that wherever my parents went in the United States, they were immigrants, right? It didn't matter if it was going to be New York, a small town in Clovis or whatever. Like, they were immigrants wherever they went in this country. And so that's a different perspective. And maybe it was something that I needed to think more about. That, I mean, of course, I think they would recognize the differences, but to them, I think just being here in the United States was already like a big adventure, you know?
Do you think it delivered for them?
That is a great question. And my initial response is no. I don't think it did, actually. And I think this is now part of my own kind of like cynicism, is I do think there is this idea of the American dream, and maybe they achieved their version of it, but by the standards of what probably the larger majority would think of, no, I don't think they achieved that outward appearance of the American dream, right? I don't think it's achievable, to be quite honest. So,
No,
yeah,
no, quite. But I think
yeah.
I'm just thinking about what you were talking about, sort of your own trauma of sort of trying to acclimatize in a place that was, sort of an unknown territory and probably could never be known, in so many ways, but also that the gap between our projected hope and aspiration, of moving to a savior place or to a place that could deliver on a hope, and then reconciling with a colonial power and the structures of inherited racism, or and just the understanding, certainly from my own family point of view. My uncle migrated from Jamaica as a kid with kind of the Windrush generation, and um, I was always really struck by how his denial of racism was so important to his survival mechanism, and that, but in that denial, that the generation, his kids, my cousins who I grew up with, like my sisters and brothers, really, um, was that sort of, then it's almost like a glitch somehow, where they want to believe the dad, but then their experience is like, actually, this is not our experience. Like, it's like they've got different shades on, and they're seeing a completely different picture, and their disappointment is not, they don't want to shatter that illusion because it would be so painful to the parents to shatter the illusion, and also, but also to know what has been given up to make that transition. And so I think what you're is familiar. What you're saying to me is familiar, but I was also wondering how honest they were about that, whether there was a disappointment or a delusion, so in the system that they had anticipated, because that can be quite a heavy burden to carry as a kid, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if my father has, since passed away, but my mother, is still alive. And I think if you would ask her this question, I think all of us would undeniably say my mother has lived an amazing, full life, right? Like she really has had quite an incredible life, like many immigrants. Like can't really imagine like as a single Filipino woman in the late '60s immigrating by yourself to not one but two countries, working, having children, having grandchildren, and now even great grandchildren. I mean, it really kind of blows my mind. I have two cats, and a partner, and that is already just like blowing my mind, So I don't even know how to
Yeah.
do that. But the reality of things are too is that my father, he ended up retiring early and moving back to the Philippines. And when this was all happening, I was still finishing. I have an older sibling, and she had already had some kids at that time, so there were already some grandchildren. But I think I think what happened was, I think one day my father woke up and realized that he was living in a culture where he was, my father had worked largely as an executive in, computer engineering and computer science for companies that were data processing. I think part of, the early question of like, why did he end up in this small town in California? I actually know some of the answers to that, which was, he was offered a job that paid very well, that was helping create systems of like ATM machines and things like that. Like, how do you process all this data? And he climbed very quickly in this company and became a vice president. And from my experience, it meant every morning seeing my dad in a suit and tie with a cup of coffee going out the door when I was waking up, and then him not coming home till much later in the evening,
Yes.
eating dinner, drinking a beer, going to sleep, and repeating,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, I think again, not to project on my father, but from my opinion, I think what happened was one day he woke up and he's like, I'm putting this tie on every day, part of this system that I don't really want to be part of or believe in anymore. So in a very unconventional way, he retired early, moved back to the Philippines. And that could be a whole other episode we talk
Yeah.
about. and and interesting enough was a lot of what I had thought about when I was making a short film as a film student. But anyway, my mother decided not to go, right? She wanted to stay. There
Wow.
were grandchildren. Her children were here. She had created a life here. And, so I think part of that move on my father's half, I think, was maybe a recognition that life doesn't only exist here in the United States, that there's plenty of life also still at the time left to live in the Philippines.
So that kind of Philippine part of your life, is that, how did that manifest as you were growing up as a kid? What were the kind of, so you're moving, in a sense, you're aware of the two cultures, but what were the Filipino traditions that you connected to?
Yeah, I mean, to be quite honest, I don't really know. It's like as an adult, when I look back, I'm thinking like, oh yeah, there are things that just Filipino culturally, like whether it be the food that we ate, the kind of culture and social dynamics between us that I recognize are very Filipino or Asian. But it was hard to really compare because I didn't really. I mean, that was the thing is I didn't really have anything to compare it to other than my white friends
Yeah.
or in that area, other Asians would be. I had a lot of friends who were Japanese because the area was also largely prior Japanese farmland that was all seized during World War II and Japanese incarceration. So I remember early on when we first moved there, and I don't remember what things are now, and clearly I don't live in California, but at the time, I remember we'd have to fill out these forms, and there'd be a box that you click for, that you fill in, or a Scantron you bubble in for, race or ethnic origin. And I remember my mother specifically saying, "Oh, don't say Asian, say Pacific Islander, because if you say Asian, they're going to think you're like Japanese or Chinese or Korean. So just say Pacific Islander so they'll understand." Now, I mean, I think that's a really complicated thing, but in my opinion, I think the Filipino cultures is Asian Pacific Islander. Like it's a kind of a mix of different things. And so even within meeting other kids who were Asian, I felt disconnected because a lot of them were East Asian.
Yeah.
And then there were other kids from Southeast Asia. The area was largely Laotian and Hmong refugees and immigrants. And I was also encouraged to not be friends with them, which was certainly a racist and classist agenda there to not you know be friends with them. Sadly, but again, yeah, it was hard to really understand what Filipino was because I didn't really have anything else to compare it to.
So you won the gifted scholarship. So you end up training in the kind of science field, right? So,
Well, so let me clarify. So at the time there was, I don't know if it still exists, but in California at the time they had what was called the GATE program, like GAT, and it was gifted and talented education. And what that meant was like I think it was like oh, this is interesting. I think it was like every Friday or every other Friday, these group of kids would get together and we would do an activity that was supposed to like, engage us further. And I actually have it in the living room, but like I remember one of the activities was like we did a poetry book where we all wrote poems and then bound it together and created the book. So there was some like creative things. And just on a side note, what was really funny is my poem was life is like a skunk. It stinks. And then I drew a skunk with like little odor things coming out of its tail. Like, can you
brilliant.
imagine? Like, that's what I did. And then we had some kind of like teacher parent night thing to like unveil it. I'm sure my parents were like totally like mortified when they saw like, yes, our child did that one. And the other ones were
That's
like, I love sunshine and things like that. Or root beer floats make me feel great.
That's so brilliant. It's genius, but perhaps not what they were expecting.
I,
I love that. Life is like a skunk. I love that. So, but there was something in that, the rebel in you, if you like, which is beautifully illustrated there, because I think sometimes in understanding that we are different, celebrating that difference in a way is, we have to kind of create a separation between us and the thing in some way, don't we? And I think that's a really
yeah,
great
yeah,
illustration, quite literally, of you standing back and observing something that didn't feel quite right to you in some way. So
Yeah.
is that an accurate reflection of what you were moving through at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, maybe visibly, people probably thought I was starting to, early on I was very introverted, to the point where I think a lot of people don't believe me when I say that, but I was. And, oftentimes I would be very comfortable just like, playing alone in my room, or occasionally with the neighborhood friends, but I didn't necessarily have like, the best friends that I saw every day, like, that kind of thing. I had groups of different people. And then I do think I learned to adapt and I learned how to become more extroverted. And certainly now I think my outward appearance is I'm very extroverted, but I'm also very comfortable with more introverted, you know, life events. And, interesting enough, my husband is very introverted. So I think we definitely, so compared to him, I'm super extroverted. But I always joke and say I'm an introvert that's learned how to become extroverted. And I think that
I
was
can
part of
really
it.
relate to that. Yeah,
That's the
and
survival technique, right? It's because you're
it
dropped
is.
in and it doesn't necessarily benefit you wholly to just be introverted. Like you have to learn how to maneuver through the
That's
space and
right.
not get beat up. Like to be quite honest, it was stuff like that. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, early on, I also fought a lot. I remember even when I was in junior high, I got into fights because there'd be kids who like called me a fag, or whatever, said something. I remember I had some kid who ran up to me and then he put his hand on my face and he was like, "Look, he wears makeup." And I was like, "What the?" And I didn't know what else to do, so like I literally threw a punch. Like
Mm.
we got into a physical altercation. I ripped his shirt. Like there was that kind of thing. So I'm not proud of turning more towards a physical and violent reaction, but that's what happened when I was like 13, 14. Like
Yeah.
that confusion, came out as anger.
Yeah.
And again, I think that surprised a lot of people because outwardly I was like, friendly. I was doing well in school at that point. I had groups of friends, but things like that would happen.
Yeah.
And yeah. And I remember at some point there was a little bit of a mentality of like, you punch me, I'm going to punch you back. Like that was my mentality. Not maybe one that I would take today, but at the time that was what I knew. That was my
Yes.
reaction, right?
Well, firstly, you have hormones flying around the body,
Yeah, totally.
so, who
Yeah,
doesn't feel like throwing a punch as a teenager,
yeah,
frankly? You know? So there's that. But then there's also that there is something interesting about that assertion and that sort of boundary holding, because I think, who knows what would have happened if you hadn't done that, actually.
yeah,
So it's a
yeah,
really instinctive survival mechanism. So somehow you were finding ways to navigate your way through it, but you were taking that gifted program and then you applied yourself, taking that part of your brain because you're a incredible creative who can also you've got left and right brain switch, right? So you can turn it on and access those different parts in a way. So you tell us a bit about the kind of the study route and some of the takeaways from that, because I think there's some interesting things that have crept into your films, and I'd be curious if you can share anything that you think you learnt at that time that is useful to you now in your art.
yeah. So I found myself doing well in the sciences, and I enjoyed it. I don't want to paint a picture too that like, oh, even though I sometimes joke and say I'm a former scientist, but it's actually true. Like I enjoyed the sciences. I really loved crazy things. Like I loved organic chemistry, which you never hear creatives say that, but I loved organic chemistry. I loved biology. I loved learning about how the kind of natural world kind of functions in a strange way. And maybe because growing up feeling like a sense of loss of control, like it was one way to kind of understand the world through these very regimented and kind of universally, maybe now questionable, but like at the time, universally accepted scientific, theories and axioms and, all these kinds of things. So, you know, ha, as an elementary school kid, primary school, being really interested in the arts, by the time I got into high school, there was a lot of focus on like, do well in the sciences, try to get a scholarship and go to college, which I did. I started really valuing education and I did start thinking like my life would benefit from going to college, going to a university. So I ended up going to the University of California, San Diego. At the time, I was a real big fan of the UC system, the University of California system. Not that I'm not today, but at the time, and I thought UCSD at the time had an amazing program in biological sciences. So I went there, but what happened was I applied for that, and then I learned that you could double major. So when I accepted, I declared a double major in biology and visual arts. Unbeknownst to everyone other than myself, I did that, and that somehow officially started my trajectory of me becoming a filmmaker today. And I did complete both degrees. I ended up entering as a visual arts studio, and I, explored painting and sculpture and things that were more studio based, but eventually found photography, and then through photography found filmmaking, which is what I ended up, pursuing, postgraduate. But I did complete my science degree. So I do have a bachelor's of science in molecular biology, and I did really focus upon human genetics. And I worked in a lab for several years, two different labs. I worked at the Salk Institute for a professor who was, doing research in cancer research. And then I ended up in another lab with a really great professor named Dr. Imo Scheffler, who was this German scientist who at the time was really known for writing a textbook on cellular biology. So again, I don't want to paint the picture of like, it was just something I thought of and was forced to do. Like, no, I did it. Like, I got the
Yeah.
degree, I worked in the field, I was in a lab using pipettes and, DNA sequencing and all of these kinds of things. But I remember it got to a point where I thought, is this my life? And what was interesting was when I was entering college, I very much remember, I was coming from the point of view of like, well, I have to support myself through college. And this is around the time that, my father had early retired and my mother, was working. And so, my, teenage years, I kind of think a little bit, I identify more with like kids who had single parents that were working, because I was largely being raised at that point by my mother, who was a working mother. So I was coming from a more working class background, and I remember thinking like, if I'm going to spend all this money and enter the system, I'm doing it for me. Like, if it's purely my education, which is why I added art to it.
Super
And I'm
smart.
not Yeah, and I'm not sorry that I did the sciences, but what I will say is I think studying, working in, and training in the sciences and being a scientist or, early career scientist at the time, it really made me think about process, right? Because what you're doing is you're training yourself and being trained within the scientific method, right? There
Yeah.
is a question you have. What are the ways that you go to explore that question? What are the things that you discover? What are the things that you discover that were different from what you thought? And then what I most love about it, that I would love to think is applicable to all of us as creatives, is that there's no bad experiment because you learn from it,
Yeah.
right? So even if something quote unquote fails, it's knowledge gained, right? And you are encouraged to go back, do it again, and recognize now that you have that knowledge, you will pivot and try something else. There isn't this thought that like you get it on the first time. It's like, no, you spend years thinking of something and trying these different things, and then and then you come up with these ideas, and then we all recognize like someone will discover something else and everything shifts. There's a paradigm shift. There's a, something. And I love that.
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I have a question that seems like a really dumb question, so I hope you'll forgive me, but you are the person for me to ask it of. So I was reading a book by a podcast guest who's coming on soon called Anne-Laure Leconf, which is called Tiny Experiments. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend listeners, particularly for artists, and listen to it on audiobook. And what's interesting is Anne-Laure was working at Google, and then went back and started studying neuroscience and understanding how the kind of experiments, exactly as you're saying, were so relevant to taking a kind of an experiment and giving it a certain period of time, but seeing it as a learning journey. And I think what you're describing is so important, but because I think in the scientific world, it's absolutely encouraged that you would have a line of inquiry or a question that you are trying to discover the answers to. And all of those micro failures, if you like, are part of an accepted learning process. And there's something about a scientific framework that is much more applauded and uh, sort of understood somehow in culture, right? That's like but the irony is that they are very often abstract propositions, right? There has to be a little element of a leap of faith to say, I have a hunch that this thing is worth following, right? And so in the arts, to me, it's exactly the same. So it makes perfect sense, like you working on something about life itself, which is such a fascinating subject to all artists. It's like sort of from the internal landscape, philosophy, psychology, kind of what it is to be human, to be non-human. These are the questions that artists ask as well as scientists. So it makes perfect sense to me. Why do you think that the scientific framework of research is so much more accepted compared to an artistic framework of research?
That's a great question. I think a large part of it was, it was interesting because I would meet these scientists, and clearly what a lot of them were doing was seeking knowledge, right? So, okay, in this experiment, I will learn a cell does this, or DNA does this, or but it's very expensive for them to do this research. They have to have a lab with which means several researchers, employees, all the costs. These things are not cheap. So everything has to be applicable, right? And at the time, everything was being attributed to cancer research, or, it was early in the days of AIDS research, things like that. So it had to be somehow tied and applicable. And I saw all the scientists trying to say that, like, oh, well, my research will look at this, and eventually it can be used to think about weight loss, or something like that, or a form of cancer. And that was the way that they got largely funded, these grants. So I guess what I'm saying is I think there's a framework where the general public thinks that the scientific knowledge is directly applicable to our everyday life, right? So if you tell someone like, well, this scientist is working on cancer research, right? And then you say, this artist is looking at and dismantling racist histories in the United States. Which one would you fund or support? I think people would say, well, the cancer research person is saving lives, right? So we're going to do that. And there's not a recognition of the person making that work that's dismantling racist systems could also be saving lives, right?
That's right.
And I think that's it, right?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about how it was tied to um, capitalism and colonialism.
Oh
Be-
yeah.
because of the outcomes. Certainly, so I was talking to a science friend of mine we were comparing kind of science papers and science research and kind of all of the kind of the politics that go into that world, which is not unlike the kind of the strange art world system, which is a little smoke and mirrors. Suppositions have to be made, giant claims have to be made, and like we're gonna change the world, like you say. Like with arts funding, it's like I'm going to help all of these communities in X, Y, and Z do X, so I'm going to transform the world. Whereas in actual fact, one or two of those things, but it's about the individual quest in both fields is what changes culture, right? So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
actually, but I think that the outcome in terms of economic benefits is now being made for the arts. But that quantifiable thing, I think, is like systems of labor, right? They relate more
Yeah.
to systems of labor in a slightly different way. I just think it's fascinating because I see so many parallels between the arts and science, and that really it's about stretching your thinking as far as you possibly can go, right? So stretching your thinking and using the tools that it's possible to kind of to help you with that line of inquiry. And in a way, you're kind of managing your thoughts and then evidencing to yourself over and over again, if I tweak this, if I do this, if I do that, then I can shape. But I see, yeah, like you say, the benefits are a little harder to kind of represent. But anyway, it's something I've been thinking about a lot because I hear so many artists kind of struggle with the language of justifying their endeavors.
Yeah.
And so they often borrow from academia or other worlds as a way of justifying that quest. But the kind of the knowledge and the research and the depth that they go to make the work that they do, I see very similar processes at play. Do you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think the sciences are completely creative. I would often think like I'm coming full circle because I do think for certain scientists and those working in that field, like you're right, it just doesn't come at, like these ideas have to come from somewhere. We don't know where they come from, but they're inspired by what they learn, and then they have questions about the, like, literally the universe or the way that life works, and then they kind of go about. And there's such a leap of faith too, because especially if you're working as I was in the molecular and the cellular level, like it's not things that you can actually see from your visible eye. You just have to believe these things are happening, and you come up with all these things that prove that what you believe is happening is actually happening until someone proves you wrong. And I do think there is a community element to it because we largely don't think like, oh, the way that we understand DNA is because one person discovered it. No, it's a combination of different scientists from around the world.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you could easily find a book or watch a documentary that's like the race to discover DNA, right? And like, what did this person do? What did this person do? What did this person do? And then we finally get to like Watson and Crick, and they discovered this, right? And there's probably still things happening. So it's part of a much larger conversation, a bank of knowledge and resources. So even though there's the individual work, there's always recognition that it's part of this larger scientific community and history. And I think artists are kind of the same way, but I think the general public doesn't really think of it so much that way. They think of artists as more like the individual maker.
Well, I'm really glad you raised that because I think actually very often we've kind of fallen in love with that myth too.
Yeah.
Partly because we're introverts and we think, because of that, we like being in the studio, making work on our own. But actually, nobody has an exciting creative career on their own. It's very rarely possible. The idea that you are discovered and suddenly the world opens up for you is a myth in my experience. So that idea that we are part of a community is something that you've committed your life to in many ways, haven't you? So I can understand that sort of that knowledge in science knowledge is is an ecosystem of knowledge, as is arts. And I think what I understand is from that kind of double major and you moving through photography into film, there was something in you kind of taking a line of inquiry, but also falling in love with storytelling. And so how did that happen for you, PJ?
Yeah, when I was studying photography, I think I found myself largely making work that was more, narrative and structure. I mean, of course, we can argue everything has a narrative to it, but I literally started making photographs that were like three photographs, and if you see all three together, it's sequential and there's a little kind of narrative arc. And then, of course, I discovered literally the moving image, and and how much richness comes with sound and audio and that experience. And I think for me, filmmaking became a way that's being creative and collaborative, and I like ultimately being collaborative. So I like working with a lot of people behind the camera, and I like following a lot of people in front of the camera. There's something really exciting, and I think all aspects of my life kind of converge around these concepts of filmmaking. It's collaborative, it's these big projects, it's a question I have, it's a journey, it's an exploration, and I think it just kind of it works for me, in a lot of ways. I do miss more sometimes, the more singular experience of doing photography and things like that. But again, maybe there is something about having a more introverted childhood and moving towards a more extroverted, outward presenting self that it helps me in the creative process to be around other people and to know that I'm part of a project or a creative experience with a group of people.
You like that discursive aspect of it?
I do, and I often, a lot of the times, like I will end up meeting people, and and people say, "What's your hobby?" Or "What do you like to do when you're not working?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" Like,
Yeah,
oh,
it's all the
I make
same.
films. Yeah, it's like and the reality of it is, if someone just randomly, and I welcome this, if somebody wants to do it, randomly gave me a ticket to just go to some place in the world, and it's supposed to be a vacation, a holiday, like, you bet I'm going to come back, or in that experience think of a film, or that experience is somehow going to influence something I'm going to make later. Like, life is what is the ultimate inspiration for work. So life doesn't stop, during certain hours of the day. And maybe other people have that experience in other fields, but I think certainly, at least the people that I've met in my experience who work in creative fields, it's a 24/7 kind of thing. Like, you dream of something, you wake up, you experience in something, even earlier, just saying like, "Oh, my cat wants to go out." Like, that could inspire a whole film about someone with a cat,
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
you found your language. What was the first film that you made where you were following that line of inquiry and finding your feet?
That's a great question. I mean, so I started studying. I did a little bit of filmmaking while I was in in undergraduate, and I largely studied with this French filmmaker, Babette Mangault, who, excuse me, was one of the first women filmmakers and cinematographers in France at, I can never remember the institution in Paris, but I made a couple literal black and white, shot on a Bolex kind of films, which arguably are probably some of my first films. But the first film that I actually made and kind of, put out in film festivals and perhaps maybe started getting attention were these short narrative films that I made in graduate school. And I went to the University of Texas at Austin in their film program. And I consider this as maybe my first film because it was a film that I wrote the script, got actors, kind of put it out there. And it was two men in a laundromat kind of getting into a discussion about, quote unquote, life. And in the process of it, really talking about their relationship, and one of them gets frustrated with the other and kind of leaves him in the laundromat, and then kind of, so it was kind of like a relationship kind of film. And I think, what it did for me was I was exploring a queer couple on screen. I was trying to take something that is, a possible real life experience, like people end relationships, romantic relationships, all the time, but also inject a little bit of humor and just, kind of convey that to an audience in like 5 minutes, that kind of thing. But I did it as an assignment in school. Didn't think, not that I didn't think much of it, but like, my expectations were just to complete it as an assignment. And then, I submitted the film to a few film festivals, and it premiered at the Frameline Film Festival in San Francisco, which in the United States is the largest LGBTQ plus film festival, and maybe even around the world, it's one of the largest. And it played in front of a feature film directed by Quentin Lee, who has a long history of being, this queer Asian American director and filmmaker from now based in Los Angeles, originally, I think, from San Francisco, and whose family comes from Hong Kong. And so my first kind of public screening was walking out onto stage at the Castro Theater in San Francisco, which, for those who are not familiar, is considered the gay neighborhood of San Francisco, which is obviously one of the biggest gay kind of cultural areas in the world. So as a film student, to walk out into the Castro Theater, which is the celebrated theater literally in the heart of the Castro, to introduce my tiny little film to maybe, hundreds of people in the audience, it was quite a experience.
Yeah.
And to just be like, wow, people are expecting to see this, recognizing it, appreciating it. It was a real, like, formative kind of moment that made myself think, like, oh, putting yourself out there and trying to do these things, like, there's an audience there's a community and a public that responds to it, that appreciates it. And perhaps that was one of the largest boosts of courage and encouragement that I got very early on, because that was my first year of graduate school. So whether or not I felt that from peers and people surrounding me, I felt it there at that moment. I knew it was possible.
You knew it was possible. Yeah, I think that's so important. I think a few things there. Just one, that you took action and you kind of went with it. Maybe we do in our youth, the naivety of youth, where we think, yeah, I'll give it a shot, and then you step into that space. So you actually lent into what was possible for you, but it also reflected back to you what you needed right at the right moment, which is, yes, this is possible for you. Yes, there's an audience. Yes, you can keep doing it. So from that moment, what was it about the feedback or your own reflection on the work that made you think, actually, these are the elements that I want to carry forward next? These are the things that I'd like to keep mining. What was the seam that you decided you wanted to keep mining?
Yeah, I mean, the making of the film was just, I mean, of course it was stressful. Filmmaking is stressful, but I think I am the type of person who finds a way to kind of thrive in these kind of high stress environments. I'm laughing because I recently watched The Pit, which is, that television show about working in the ER. And like, I mean, of course, filmmaking is not, in that sense, but like that narrative so centers around this like constant trauma, that's physical trauma that's happening, right? These people coming in with accidents. And it's a very particular person who can probably thrive or work in that and not have a complete mental breakdown, which of course some of the characters
Yes.
are facing that. So I think filmmaking is similarly because it's such a high power structured kind of and at times even authoritative kind of way of working, right? Because you have this one director who is kind of dictating a lot of it, and there's certainly a lot of hero worship that can go along with that. But it's a real, I mean, for me, for lack of a better description, it's a fun party, like I love, it's a little soiree, getting everyone together and like say, hey guys, let's make something fun together, or really dive into something deep and work on something and then be able to present it to an audience and have discussion about it and talk about the experience. And for me, most fulfilling is finishing a piece. And I know I've spent so much time, whether that be months or years, right? Oftentimes years, especially with these feature documentaries, thinking about, agonizing, working towards in solitude with these other people, and then to release it out into the world and let it become its own thing. And then people can watch it, have their own interaction with it, have their own thoughts, and it stops becoming about me making it and me as the maker. I'm not a parent. I don't have children. I do have two, two cats with my partner, but I do think the kind of making the work and releasing it out into the world, it's some kind of, giving birth to something, right?
Yeah.
And a certain pleasure of seeing that kind of go out into the world and it not being about me anymore. It's just about, it's for someone else now to discover.
Yeah. I think there is a difference. And I think, I wonder, PJ, if you could walk us through, because I think it is such a nuanced process and there's so many aspects of it that can go, or that can prevent it from somehow landing with people. But for people who've never made a documentary, can you walk us through the life of one of your films? Like maybe take a real example, the most recent one, kind of from the concept through to like turning people onto the idea, pulling people together. How do you go? What's your process and how do you go about it?
Yeah, excuse me, a significant film for me of recent is a feature documentary that I made called Call Her Ganda, which is about a trans woman in the Philippines who unfortunately was murdered by a U.S. Marine. And the film, looks is somewhat investigative and looks like looks at what happened and the events as they were unfolding, but it also becomes a larger look at the long-lasting effects of U.S. imperialism in the Philippines and the fact that he was a U.S. Marine and local officials could not detain him because there's these agreements that essentially give the United States jurisdiction over any kind of military personnel who's accused of any crimes, which exists till today, and in my opinion, very much is a example of colonialism right there. Like the fact that you could have U.S. military in a foreign country but not be subject to the local laws is just mind blowing, right?
Yeah.
And we would not see that here in the United States, or I cannot imagine like a soldier from Germany committing a crime and suddenly the United States being like, well, we can't really do anything about it. Germany, what do you think? Like that would never happen here in the United States. But of course, it happens in the Philippines, former colony of the U.S. But anyway, that film came about because I happened to be in the Philippines screening some of my work at a queer festival, and those of and Jennifer Laude, who is the trans woman, unfortunately had been killed recent. And while I was there, I was learning about it. I was meeting a lot of grassroots activists. I eventually met the lawyer who represented the Laude family and ultimately took it to court and won, which is largely what my film looks at. So I kind of stumbled into it, for lack of a better description. It wasn't like I was searching to make a new film. I just found myself in the midst of all of this happening, and then starting to recognize maybe what I could bring to it or contribute to it in terms of making it into a film. And what's interesting about this situation is, while I was screening my work and this was happening, I was on a panel for LGBT human rights, and an audience member suggested I turn this into a film. And I remember saying like, oh, no, 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 no. I'm not going to make this film because I'm not a local grassroots activist. I'm not trans. I identify as cisgender. This is for someone else to maybe make. But I think as I reflected upon it and spoke to everyone, I started realizing my unique background and perspective as a Filipino American, as someone who, shamefully knew very little of the country and culture that my parents came from, which, by the way, was by design by the American education system to exclude that information from me, became a large reason to do it. So long story short, it ended up becoming something of, I want to make a film that I myself would benefit from watching or learning, and this will be an amazing, experience. And it was. So I started making that film. It's one of those things when you're working in documentary and nonfiction, you can only control so much of it. Like, if there's a trial that's starting, I can't stop the trial and say like, hey guys, wait until I get more funding. Like, you just have to go and shoot. And thankfully there were partners who helped me do that, whether that be like, Center for Asian American Media or the Ford Foundation, Bertha Foundation, things like that, allowed me to do that. And it ended up being a 3+ year journey.
Right.
I'm working on a film right now, which is entering 5 by the time it reaches audiences 6. I mean, it's crazy. It's like I could have
Yeah.
gotten another degree this time period.
I don't think you need one somehow.
I don't need one. I don't need one.
But I think that time is something I'd like us to return to, because I think it's an important part, not just in the medium, but in the way the subject develops. But I just want to understand how you collect that data first, in terms of how does the story unfold in your mind's eye? Do you collect text, photographs, interviews? Like, how do you pull it together and then reflect to those other kind of stakeholders or partners? So what do you gather for yourself first to make sense of the structure or and the story as you want to approach it, and then how do you present it to other people?
Well, I think, kind of going back to our earlier conversation, I think this is where maybe some of my scientific training kicks in, is like I pose a question like, why and how does this happen? Right? What exactly are we looking at, or starting to explore? And I do some basic research, just like anyone else could do, like whether that be going on the internet, reading a couple articles, seeing what's kind of already out there. But the largest thing that first happens and becomes really the foundation of the project is the in the field or investigative kind of research. So ultimately, the films that I make usually follow people right? They're character driven, they're protagonist driven. So it's me meeting people who I think or I recognize when I meet them, their lives are unfolding and are living out these things that I'm thinking about. Like, for instance, a film prior to this I made was called Before You Know It, which looks at gay seniors. And when I say seniors, like senior citizens, like 65 plus, right? And the ones I was looking at were like 80 plus, so, or some of them were 80 plus. And that was a matter of like, okay, well, I met a few of them, and one of them told me like, oh, well, I was in the closet my whole life, and then I was married, and when my wife passed away is when I felt I could start exploring, or I did start exploring my sexual identity in a different way. And that unlocked a lot of things for me to explore in terms of ageism, the culture around sexual identity and all of these things, and that interesting tension of like, culturally we try to desexualize elders, but when elders are identifying as LGBTQ plus, they're identifying by sexual gender identity. It's undeniable, right? And that kind of tension. So it lives within this person's experience, right? Ultimately, I'm most intrigued by and fascinated by people's lived experiences. And by looking at these lived experiences, presenting them to an audience, I'm hoping that people understand also these social issues and the context that these people are living in. So, so with Call Her Ganda, I end up following the lawyer who's following the family, the mother of the slain victim, Jennifer Laude, her mother, and also a reporter who's also trans and Filipino, who's at the time living in New York, and through their stories, we look at different ways that people are grappling with, law enforcement, the history of, the law, the history between the United States and the Philippines, all these things, just by what they kind of live through. So for me, it's all about life experiences and someone, willing to allow me to capture that and present it to an audience, which of course is a huge amount of responsibility and trust building that needs to happen. And I don't
Yeah.
take that lightly because I don't think I would do it myself.
Well,
So it'd be hard to
maybe.
be on the other side. Yeah.
I think, but what strikes me as interesting, and I wonder if this is, I don't want to project here because obviously I've not been on a shoot with you, but I get a real sense that you could engender trust with people very easily. So you have obviously a gorgeous smiley face. For those people who are
Oh, thank you.
listening, BJ's got the most beautiful, radiant face, but you have one of those faces that people can write themselves onto in a way, because like I'm sure people unravel all kinds of stories to you. But it strikes me that you're picking stories that you want to know the answers to, as you said, that there's something you want to learn, but also you're kind of writing histories into culture that you would also like to see reflected back to you somehow. So I'm kind of going back to our earlier discussion. It kind of makes sense to me as to what keeps you going over a period of time, because you're learning on the way as the story's unfolding, and you might not know how it's all going to piece together until you've got all the component parts. But there's something, you have to have a reason to keep going, right? Because as you said, it's hard and you're dealing with lots of different constituent parts, people, emotions, high drama, moments of sadness, tension, melancholy, kind of, there must be all kinds of things in the mix, as well as your own emotional inner weather, kind of, so that the reason for doing it has to feel worthwhile, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, making films and making documentaries really have been my way of investigating the world. It's been my therapy. It's been, I think anything that I make, and I'm sure other people feel similarly. Like, it's all personal, whether or not it appears as such, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason why this story or this subject or this topic I'm gravitating towards. Like, if I were to make something about, I don't know, a small, village in the Philippines wrestling with climate change, like there probably is something there about me thinking about, oh, what's that story that I'm gravitating towards about the everyday person battling this large, institution, and battling literally nature, all these kinds of things. Like, there's something I'm going to gravitate towards, whether in my personal experience I felt that way, or I literally have been in that situation, or I knew someone who was, and I was thinking about it. So, in a
Yeah.
way, all these stories, all these films become life markers for me in terms of now being able to look back and say, like, oh, I remember, during this time period, I really was thinking about getting older. And guess what? I made a film about aging seniors, gay
Yeah.
seniors, right? Or, Call Her Ganda came at a time when I was really thinking about my Filipino American identity and my colonized childhood and my parents' migration story. And that's kind of what came out of it. So I do think what keeps me going despite how difficult it is, and trust me, it has just gotten even more difficult with the state of the world and the
Yes.
lack of support for the arts, including filmmaking. It makes me a better person. It makes me understand myself more. And I think it provides me an opportunity and a way that I think I can contribute to society. So, yeah, it's partially narcissistic reasons because, like, I
Well, do you
want to
know,
help
and maybe
myself.
I think I love the honesty because it's something that I work with artists on all the time. Is I think that if we are radically honest, even when we're in service to others, of course there is part that it's addressing for ourselves. And I
Of
think
course.
the more I understand artists and doing incredible work as you are, PJ, I think the more honest you are about actually answering something for ourselves, the better the work gets. So I think the fact that you're so in tune with that, I think is what makes the work have that criticality in it, and that actually the personal and the political is something that's deeply fused in all of the things that you do. So it definitely serves more than your own interests. But unless you solve that for yourself first, the work doesn't quite hit the sides in my experience. So I love the fact that you're so honest about that. I have to ask you though, because you wear three hats, right, when you're filmmaking. Tell me, what's that about? Is it important for you to be the person that kind of directs, produces, and shoots? Why is that so important to you?
Yeah, when early on, when I was making these documentaries, I definitely wore all three hats very equally. Like, I was on the ground, the person who's, developing this, directing it and shooting it. Now I try to, be more collaborative and work with others. So, I will have usually more than one producer helping me because it is such a huge endeavor. I love working with cinematographers. I'll be honest, partially I'm also just, it's hard to get everything done when you got a camera in your hand, even
Yeah.
just having to put it down to like do these things.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. But also I just, the crew that I work with are the people that I just love being around. And, there's always fun conversations to be had and life experiences to be had together. So I try to not do all three equally anymore. And if I'm successful at it, that's great because that means there was some resources there to make sure that I could kind of do that. But to your question, like, I think my brain just kind of does all three naturally because you think about what needs to happen to get the film made and going, and then when you're in the moment, you have to make these decisions about which direction you're going to go, and ultimately the best way to tell this story in this moment, which is literally directing at that moment on the fly. And then you think about the way to capture it, which is how is this going to be communicated visually through a camera and through sound. So I think, sometimes I meet, emerging filmmakers and I tell them, like, you have to know all filmmaking to understand how it works. Sure, you can specialize, but if you don't understand how a camera works and visual storytelling, well, then how are you going to work with a cinematographer and tell, him, her, them, like, what to capture and how you want it captured and how you want it to make you feel and things like that. Like, you have to understand all these things. So my brain just kind of does that all the time.
Yeah. So it's a deep
I
language.
love how when I
of
said that,
it.
my camera just dramatically zoomed out. Center stage on it. Like, see, even the computer camera knew to emphasize that line. But
I think I love
yeah,
that because actually what you're talking about is learning the craft of something from the inside out. And I think that's sort of understanding then the language of how the lighting or the framing of a character or the way something's cropped or edited or where the music goes and what music. When you understand the whole construction, it means you can be more fluid on the fly, right? So that can, in a sense, you can make sort of almost intuitive decisions as you're going.
yeah, absolutely. And I think you know, it's thinking about the ways to take your own experience at that moment and put it into an expressive form for someone else to understand it or gain from it in a way. I do think what I really love about filmmaking too is I do think it's such a highly accessible medium. And what I mean by that is I do feel like most people feel like they can watch anything and have an opinion on it,
Mm.
and I like that. I kind of like that, and maybe sometimes it's to a fault that people say like, well, if I, and even though they're not filmmakers, would be like, well, I would have done this. And you're like, okay, yeah, sure. Like,
Yeah.
let's see what you would have done in that situation. But I do like that, right? It seems like most people can kind of watch a film and enter a film and think about it. So
Has the rise of the short vertical content had an impact on the way you think about any aspects of your filmmaking?
I ultimately am making, feature length and, short films in the sense of like over 10 minutes, oftentimes 20 minutes. So I think the rise of these short verticals, it's a different form of storytelling.
Yeah.
I don't think it's quite what I do, but it's certainly adjacent. And I think people are gaining, in some categories, some people are gaining quick knowledge, whether it be more through like a news platform or some kind of topical video that literally within 15 seconds they're getting some quick information, and hopefully directed towards a place to learn more. And I think for some people, it's short attention span storytelling that can
Yeah.
happen. I haven't really explored or looked into these micro dramas that are happening where it's like
Mm.
someone can watch something for 30 seconds and have a cliffhanger within like a minute. Like, I don't know. I think for me personally, I like things that are a little bit longer. But
Yeah.
again, I haven't really looked into it, so I really shouldn't say that. But what I'm relying upon in terms of the type of work that I'm making is, back to our original idea of like the captivated audience,
Mm.
So for me, watching films in theaters and theatrical spaces are still really important because I think it's important to go into a room, turn the devices off or silence them, be in a room with other people, collectively experiencing something, and feature length often allows for that, whether
Yeah.
that be commercially in a theater or at a film festival. I was just on the jury for the Austin Asian American Film Festival, and it was incredible because going into these theaters and hearing people collectively like sniffle and cry or gasp or laugh like you feel so connected to other people, like, oh yeah, you feel that way too, or oh, we're having this moment together. um,
Yeah.
and that's a large driving force of filmmaking. I mean, I think the vertical storytelling probably does allow that, but since people are, isolated and, in the individual screen, maybe it's a little less so.
Yeah, I was thinking about it just because I've never, the last few years in particular, there are more people in different walks of life understanding some of the principles of storytelling through film that I'm surprised by. Even it, but there's usually it's for a commodity purpose, as in it's selling something, obviously. But even so, from the language of advertising and filmmaking, and whether it's TikTok or YouTube, there's a real sort of understanding of how to connect with an audience and take them on some kind of emotional experience. And I can see a lot of it is feeding back into storytelling, but it's interesting to me how many films or programs on TV are being made with the algorithm in mind. And the bit that I think is so interesting that you're talking about is very often it's the strange, the uncanny, the odd, the slightly unexpected that artists and filmmakers in particular. That's the bit that's very hard to teach when you kind of you in that split second moment where you see what's lying underneath the story, that a time and long form really helps you unpack in a way. So I like you, obviously, because of the podcast, and I know we've kept you for a very long time already, but I'm a fan of long form content because I think actually the nuance and understanding how somebody is thinking through a silence, or the way their face reflects a pause, or what they're about to say. We learn so much about somebody's creativity from having those moments. And of course, we make short form clips for people as teasers. But I think, what I really want is when people hang out with somebody over a longer period of time, they get a real sense of their sensibility, what they've learned over time, what's important to them, and actually that kind of that intimacy with people, and especially with creative people. It's that knowledge of what fire they've walked through to make their stuff. I think is really important because there's a human story for all of us makers. There's a story there that is rarely told because we're in service of the work, and so we tell the story of the work. And I guess what we're sort of interested here is also understand, what does an artist have to go through to make that thing that seems like it was always meant to be that way. So I think we're interested in community here. I know you are, and because you spend an enormous amount of time building communities, from Queer Bomb, Outsider, and your work with emerging filmmakers. How has that community building and participation within communities gone on to inform the content or the way that you make and think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think community is such a large aspect to what I'm interested in doing. Probably largely because in my upbringing, I feel like I didn't have one. You know,
Yeah.
I felt like an audience of one. So I think there is something to that. I think there's something to the power of the number of people, right? Like I think, all the different metaphors we have of like, the singular ant can't do that, but the colony of ants can like take down a whole, build a whole mount, ant hill, or move an apple, something like that.
Yeah.
Like I think there is something to the power of the number of people and the collective kind of power, right? That can happen. So for me, I've filmed a lot of them, and I think in the process of doing that, I think it's also important to have that just in my personal life as a filmmaker, as a queer person, as an Asian American, So it's interesting because later today I have a steering committee meeting for the Asian American documentary network, which is called ADOC. And I'm part of that network because what's great about it is I'm able to contribute with some of my experience already as a documentary filmmaker and, as someone who's Asian American, but also being able to create initiatives and programs and opportunities that I myself will benefit from, and being able to know that everyone else will benefit from it also because I know what it's like to kind of do that. So part of it is kind of this concept of what maybe some people will call service, right? Like this idea, but going back to what we mentioned earlier, ultimately some of this service is also self-serving, right? Because you're also, hopefully providing resources and opportunities for everyone else, and that ultimately helps your field and you as a maker and as a filmmaker also. And it feels good to give back, right? It should.
Yeah.
Like,
I think
you
there's
know?
a way that you just described it then, for some reason, because I'm a visual person too, I was thinking about a loaf of, like making a loaf of bread. You know how when you fold in the dough into the middle, and so there's something about that folding in of experience and feedback and input, and that you seem to thrive on, and then that kind of the folding in of the input from other people helps you to kind of rise your loaf of bread, so to speak. Do you know that you are continuously growing, and growing with people is how you kind of your momentum progresses. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, I really am a believer that we as individuals are constantly growing and learning and, expanding, evolving, and so I do place a lot of emphasis on these kind of experiences, and it's ultimately meaningful to also grow alongside other people and be part of something. I also think, there's something for me that's also really fulfilling about accomplishing something with groups of people.
Mm.
Because there is something that's like, okay, we did it, right? There's something ultimately satisfying of accomplishing, and completing some kind of challenge, some kind of thing. I'm not into like, I was looking earlier this morning and some friend did some like Spartan race or, ran 5K, or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. I don't do those kinds of things necessarily, but I could understand how the success, the feeling of accomplishment, like you set out to do this, you did it, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you even set a goal for yourself. Like if I can do at this time, maybe it feels like I've accomplished something and maybe even grown or even trained harder. I feel like that also exists like within creativity in the art world. Like maybe it's the ambition of a project or trying something you've never tried before, and then whether or not it's your strongest work. Again, you pull it off, and maybe you learn from that experience and that sense of accomplishment. I was mentioning Call Her Ganda. I don't think that could have been my first film. I would have been way too scared to make something in the Philippines, to like take a topic that's already so highly discussed in the media. Like I tended to do things prior to that a little bit quieter, a little bit more like not many people looking into it. And that one was like, there was media all over the place, especially in the Philippines talking about it. But I kind of worked my way towards that. So when I completed that film, I felt an ultimate sense of, accomplishment. Like, oh, wow, I did this. And I don't think I would have thought I could do this 5 years ago, but now here I am, right? And in the process of doing that, you recognize how you've grown or how you've changed or, maybe what's potential still of what's left ahead.
So, what are you excited about next, PJ?
Well, I am excited about moving to Toronto.
Yeah.
That is something. I mean, that is, it's like a film. I'm also excited, and I'm also like full of like, fear,
Mm.
dread of like what's happening. But I'm excited about that because I think also being in different environments and meeting new people is always inspiring. I'm working on a film right now, which I can't really talk too much about, but I've been working on it for a while, and I'm excited to, eventually get that out. And what's interesting is when I start these films, of course, they start out as ideas, and as you go along, you start shifting from it's an idea that I'm exploring to, wow, I can see this now getting closer to being completed, and start visualizing and conceiving what will happen when it's being shared with an audience. So I'm now tipping into that, which is exciting because I've been working on it for a while. And I am ultimately excited to release a new film and be able to be in conversation with different audiences about it. So I'm looking forward to that.
PJ, are there any champions that you've kind of picked up along the way that help enable you or help you on your quest? Are there any people that are particularly important to you in that sense?
Well, I mean, I did mention Babette Mangault,
Yeah.
who is a French filmmaker and cinematographer. She was someone who, I think when I was a film student, she recognized my potential before I did, and really set me up for, a filmmaking path that I wasn't even aware could exist. That was really helpful. I think my mother has been really influential because, again, I think she's someone who has lived an amazing full life, and just the bravery of kind of what she's done. I think in retrospect, I'm always like, oh, what I'm doing is like nothing compared to what my parents did, so it keeps me humble, right? In terms of thinking about, things like that. Yeah, I think, it's interesting too, because I've had, thinking about creativity, even when I was an art student, there were queer artists who really exposed me to a world of art making and creativity and creative voice, and how you can explore things like queerness and identity through that. Whether that be Thomas Allen Harris, who is a queer black filmmaker, or his brother Lyle Ashton Harris, who I studied photography with. I mean, there's something really amazing thinking about that. Some of my early education and training were with queer black artists. I mean, that has completely informed me today. So yeah, there's just so many people who have kind of, aided me, kind of in my creative journey, so to speak.
Well, it's beautiful that you're passing that on and lifting others up on your journey too. It's so needed. And we're excited to see the new film. I'm going to implore that everybody listening goes and watches some of your films and certainly connects with you. Where could they do that, PJ? Where would you like people to connect to if they follow your work and maybe subscribe to a newsletter somewhere?
Sure. The easiest way to kind of follow what I'm up to on the day to day is probably Instagram, to be quite honest. On social media, I end up posting and sharing things left and right. And that's just, at my name, which is at PJ Raval. I have a website, which is unravel.com, unraval.com. And I do post, links to trailers and things like that on there. So probably those two places are the easiest ways to kind of catch me in what I'm doing.
Brilliant. I think maybe there's a part two for when the new film comes out, and we can hear all about your new move in Toronto too. But yeah, really best of luck for the move. And thank you so much for being your gorgeous self with us and sharing so much of your journey. And long may it be an exciting adventure.
Thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be part of this. Thank you.
I wonder what resonated with you from that conversation. What stays with me is PJ's belief that every creative project begins with a question rather than an answer. Instead of chasing certainty, he follows curiosity, trusts the process, and allows the work to change him along the way. There's something incredibly hopeful about that. Creativity isn't about already knowing, it's about being willing to investigate. I also loved his reminder that no meaningful work is made alone. Whether in science, filmmaking, or art, we're all building on the generosity, courage, and knowledge of other people. Community isn't something that arrives once you've become successful. It's one of the things that makes success possible. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to help us keep these conversations reaching more extraordinary creatives. Please share it with someone who needs to hear it, post it on social media, or send it directly to a friend whose creativity you believe in. Every recommendation helps more artists, makers, and thinkers discover these conversations. So I'd love to invite you to become part of what we're building. Leaving a thoughtful review or following the show isn't just a rating, it's a way of helping those extraordinary creative lives and ideas become more visible, so more people discover the courage to make their own work. You can find all of PJ's films, projects, and latest updates in the show notes, and I highly recommend diving into his work. Until next time, keep making your best work, stay curious, and remember, don't wait for the right conditions, build them.